In season 3, we are introducing a special segment where we will invite strong and grounded voices from the media community to join us for a frank conversation on communication. Today, we have with us Ruth Esther Dsouza, joining us for the podcast where we will talk about the 10 commandments you need to understand to create and maintain a seamless working relationship with the media community. Trust me, this episode is one that you can hear again and again till you have all of them down to a pat. A little more about Ruth. She is a media professional with nearly 2 decades of experience in the field to her name. She began her career with TV as an executive producer and moved to journalism as a features writer. She went independent 13 years ago and has worked with prestigious names including Natgeo Traveller, Travel and Leisure, The Hindu, Firstpost, Al Jazeera, Quint, Huffington Post, Architectural Digest, and Reader's Digest, to name a few. While she enjoys writing on food and beverage, architecture, interiors, culture, and lifestyle, she's always up for an interesting pitch. Ruth is also on the jury panels for prestigious F&B Awards in the country and is a Google certified fake news detection trainer, conducts workshops on food writing and feature writing. So let's add her on.
Hi Ruth, welcome to our podcast. Thank you, Tarunji. Great to be here.
It's lovely to have you here. I love the stories you do. I've been following your impressive career journey for quite some time, but for the benefit of our listeners, let's start by talking about how you got started in journalism. Why did you choose this field?
Okay, so I'll be very honest. When I was growing up, I used to watch a lot of TV. I grew up in the Gulf, and one of the things I loved watching was medical serials on TV. So growing up, I actually wanted to become a paramedic. There was this huge glamour about it. But at one point, I realized that science is not a subject that I can take, and blood is not something I can handle. So
Really?
that's one dream. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can handle it. But if someone says that I have to take care of someone, then I definitely can't do that. So that totally went out the drain there. But I realized at one point, especially all through school and college, that I was very good at essay writing, and I was always selected for the inter-school and intercollegiate competitions because I could write well. And that is something that kind of took off from there. And I went on to do my BA in journalism along with English literature, and then went on to do a master's in mass communication in Manipal. And that's where I discovered that I was actually more interested not in the journalism aspect, but more in television and television production. In fact, my first byline, so to say, was an international byline on BBC World, because I was part of the team in Delhi of this company called Miditech, which worked on India's first reality show. And when I say reality show, it was not an entertainment-based one, but it was a reality show based in AIIMS, the hospital. And I was part of the research team that helped put that series on air. So this aired, if I am not wrong, in the year 2000 on BBC World. And that was my first byline. So I kind of got hang of being able to research under extreme pressure, and wanted to start my career in television. And I did begin in television with a Kannada channel based in Bangalore, ETV Kannada. Worked there for 3 years as executive producer for children's programming. And basically ideating with different directors on children's shows and how to get them to the light of day kind of stuff. Very interesting stuff I did back then. 3 years into that, I felt like I had learned whatever I wanted to do. Bangalore did not really give me too many opportunities to get into television production back then. Also, a lot of problem being female in the field, because I honestly wanted to be behind the camera, but I was told that it is not something that I could handle at that time, considering I'm on the shorter side of things, and cameras back then were not your very handy portable stuff that you get now. They were the massive cameras that you have to handle on your shoulders and stuff. So I was told I can't get into it back then, and wasn't getting a break in Bangalore in any way. So that's when I moved to journalism, the print side of it. And I was working with the newspaper in the features department, and was there for 3 years. Yeah, for 3 years. And we were working on this newspaper. It's called the Vijay Times, and we had a lovely selection of feature publications that came out with every edition of the paper each morning. So we had seven feature supplements each day. And by the time I resigned it became Bangalore Mirror at one point, because Times Group took over that paper. And by the time I resigned out of it, I was handling quality control for all 7 of those publications. And it gave me this massive look into the world of features and every part of it, whether it was real estate, whether it's culture, movies, books, food, all of it. So I had passive exposure to all of that.
So those were interesting times. Imagine having a supplement every day of the week. So the journalism space itself has changed a lot. But yet it's somewhere people who have been in journalism still keep sticking around. What keeps you here specifically?
I think it's the excitement of working on different kinds of stories. I have worked, now in the 20 years that I've been working, I have worked on stories related to food, to culture, human interest stories. I think for me, it is mainly that being able to work on something new and not being restricted to just one particular niche. So I'm what you call a generalist. I write on features in general. I do have one or two niches, but I'm again open to a lot of things. So I think that's the thing that drives me the most.
Interesting. You have chosen a very different career path for yourself within journalism itself, right? The freelance experience or the contributor or gig space, whatever you call it, it's not a very easy position to occupy in the entire journalism ecosystem. What is it like today? First of all, why did you choose to do this? And what is it like today? How has it changed?
So when I started doing this around 15 years ago, it was honestly an overnight decision because I didn't have babysitting help and I needed to get into it. Back then, being a freelance journalist wasn't really easy because no one really wanted to outsource to an independent journalist. They preferred everything in-house. But it was slightly easier for me because I was already in the field and I had some contacts that could help me out in this. Now, over the years, and honestly, it was content development kind of sustained me in terms of the finances. It has changed a lot over the years. The industry has opened out a lot more. I think it's because a lot of journalists today, the independent journalists especially, are able to work on stories which those journalists who are on roles with publications don't honestly have the time on hands to do. So if you see the kind of stories independent journalists do today, they are the ones which require long-term reporting, in-depth reporting, something that will take 2 weeks as opposed to nearly everyday deadlines that a journalist has. So that's the way the industry has evolved. There are a lot of opportunities, a lot of journalists. It's just about being in the right place at the right time and being able to pitch very well to a publication, understand them and pitch very well.
Interesting. And what was your first day like on the job?
First day as an independent journalist, honestly, what I remember of that time, I had a 1.5-year-old baby with me. So pretty much I had a baby strapped to me at all times and I was working on the computer side by side. I've had a lot of moments where I have simply just given up, sat on the floor and cried my heart out. But what I also realized at that time that there were a lot of people willing to give you a chance to be able to work it out. So if I did have a colicky baby crying in the background, honestly, nobody turned around and said, how can you be so annoying on a work call? They were all very understanding and they gave me the opportunity to call back and finish the story. My editors whom I worked with were very understanding at that time. So it had a lot of ups and downs. And that's what honestly, the beginning was pretty much it's like a whirlwind that just went past me. But I found my footing, you can say. It took me a year or so, but I've managed to find my footing and finally make a name for myself and find a place for myself in the field.
Absolutely. I think that's the story of every woman who to quit a corporate career and start freelancing. And aren't we hearing more of these stories since the last 1 year?
Absolutely, we are hearing a lot of those stories of late. I've known a lot of people who have been full-timers for most of their career in the journalism field. They may have been laid off from work or they no longer have that standing in the industry as a full-timer anymore, turning independent journalism. It has taken them a learning curve because it's very, very different from being under the banner of a publication. But what I've seen is there's a lot of cooperation in the industry and everyone's trying to help everyone out. We all understand what difficult times are. I think there's a lot of support that's there in the industry right now.
Absolutely. And when we talk about the industry, there are, like I always say, there are three sides to the triangle that we all are in, right? The brand, the PR, and the journalist. So what has your interaction been with the PR industry?
So I must say that for me, the PR industry has been a great source of leads to very interesting stories all through my career. I can't say that all of my stories have come from PR, but a lot of interesting ones have come from PR. I have some really good friends in the industry whom I turn to, not just work related, but whenever I need the resource to find something or to connect with a person, even if it's not their own client, I know there are a lot of these really good people in the PR industry whom I can turn to, and they have been of great support. So it's been a very interesting relationship. But yeah, we have discussed this earlier as well. There is a certain, perhaps the new crop of PR people who are coming in, just like as with the journalists, there is a learning curve that needs to happen. So, there can be some friction at those points as well.
Absolutely. But as a person who's been observing or interacting with the industry for quite some time now, what are some of the key changes that you've seen happen in the media PR relationship in the last decade or so?
So, in terms of changes in the relationship, I think journalists had the time to take out and discuss clients with PR people over a length of time, meet up over a lunch, have a conversation with a particular PR's client. All those things, there is no place, or honestly, not that there's no place, but there's no real time on hand to be able to do this anymore from the journalist perspective. They are battling a lot of different changes, especially with legacy publications. A lot of them had to turn to digital media almost overnight. So they have to deal with that learning curve while balancing their everyday responsibilities and trying to deal with their equation with PR. So there has been a lot of change that way. And I think even in the way PR pitches are presented these days, where earlier I used to see a lot of out of the box thinking, I have a feeling now because of the kind of pressures that the PR people are under to be able to get that exposure for their clients. A lot of attention doesn't really go into pitches anymore, and it's become very generic, almost like a templatized version of these are the things we need to get for our client. So I feel that's where a lot of things have changed, and we both have to work together to be able to bring that relationship to what it was, but in a new format.
Absolutely. And I think the changes that are happening with the media industry as well, they have a direct impact on how the PR community needs to change, to tweak, to adapt to it. And the sooner we do it, the better it is. Let's get to the subject that we want to discuss out here, right?
Sure.
I want to know from you the 10 commandments, or let's start with the first 5 first, that you want PR professionals to understand, to create and maintain a seamless working relationship with the media community. How do you want them to adapt?
To begin with, my first commandment would be for a PR person to know your client and to know your client's industry. So what I would really like is for a PR person to put themselves in the client's shoes. Think of it, the business as the client is thinking of the business and what would be the best kind of exposure that would work for them. So knowing the industry, knowing exactly how the client's business functions and what exposure would benefit the client, I think that will help PR people pitch these clients much better and to the right publications and the right journalists. So that would be my first point.
Absolutely. And it's very essential for every PR working on it to know the client in and out. It doesn't work anymore. It never did, but I think even now, even more so, it doesn't work when you just have like peripheral knowledge about the client that you're working on.
Very true. Very true. Peripheral knowledge no longer works. It is a lot of effort, especially if you are an agency balancing a lot of clients. But it is absolutely important that you get in depth into that industry completely. And only then you could position a client much better in media.
Right.
Okay. My second one is to set expectations with the client right at the beginning. Now, of course, this is from a journalist perspective because many times I get inquiries from PR people saying that I would like a profile put in your publication. Now, that's borders more on demanding, and it honestly doesn't work that way. And I'm sure it's the pressure that comes from the client. So right at the beginning, telling your client what works, what doesn't work, how each publication approaches the content that they do, that is very important. That will help a client understand where things work and what is the best kind of exposure for them as well. Because as a PR person, you have that understanding that needs to be communicated to the client, even if it means stepping on their toes once in a while. I can understand how tricky that is, but I think that is especially important in maintaining good relations with the client and also with the journalist so that there's a better output out of the entire thing. So setting expectations would be my second point.
Absolutely, but I think it comes with the scare of, losing the client. The myth that is created around PR that we can do everything that the client asks us of. Yeah, I think it
Yes.
works in everybody's favor if you are realistic about what the field can achieve. And it's okay to have a discussion, have a debate, have an argument. It's perfectly fine. I've always seen when you have that, when you put your foot down and say this is what is possible, what is not possible, you always come out of that discussion with having earned more respect from the brand team as versus saying, yes, I will get it done.
Very true. I absolutely agree with you. 100%. My third point is basically for PR people to better understand how different publications work. By this, what I mean is let me give you an example. For a lifestyle publications, most of the lifestyle publications come out on a Friday, which means their content for a weekly paper closes on a Tuesday. So if someone approaches me on a Thursday saying, can you do this? It does not work. So understanding basically how publications work, especially the ones in which you can feature your client, that is very important to be able to make the right pitch at the right time. That I feel is missing right now, and I feel that needs to be done.
Absolutely. I'm very surprised. I've had this conversation with a lot of journalists over the last 20 years, in fact. Tracking the medium, knowing the media that you're pitching to, and understanding deadlines is one of the key crucial asks. So many of the young professionals, helping them understand that knowing deadlines, tracking the media that you are going to be pitching your client is very essential. There still seems to be a slip between the cup and the lip, and it's surprising that nobody's been able to fix that.
Very true. I think what's needed at one point is some level of basic orientation that needs to happen. Ideally, it should happen when a new PR person is inducted into they shouldn't be thrown into the deep end, which often I find from my interaction with the young crop of PR people, it sounds very much like they have suddenly taken on more than they can handle. So I feel there is an orientation that's needed and a resetting of sorts that's needed, and I think that can really solve the problem to a large extent.
But I assume that a lot of these changes would have happened because I remember my first day in PR, and the first week I was given a press release on the shampoo launch and told to meet journalists to share this out with. The first publication on my list, by the way, was PTI. Going to PTI, sitting down and wanting to meet the editor because I wanted to hand over the press release that was printed and given to me, saying, please take this. And this was a new variant launch of an existing shampoo brand. No briefing, no training, no orientation given. I could not thank the editor enough. I mean, these are one of the examples I quote very often. He sat me down very patiently, helped me understand his media, his medium, deadlines, and said, this is not what you're going to do. If you want to succeed in this career, this is what you need to do. And I took that to heart. I followed it and owned that entire responsibility of making sure that I know who I'm talking to, what I'm talking to, before I actually go out there. I think a lot of responsibility also rests on the youngsters who are joining in, because you can give them that information, but for them to be able to accept it, own it, is another different ballgame.
I 100% agree with you. When you say that you have to own it, there also has to be that the proactiveness that comes from the individual themselves, the desire to learn what is the right way of doing things. I've had a lot of young PR people come up to me and say, I know I may be approaching this wrong, but if I am, can you tell me how to do it? And I have honestly tried and taken time out to help them do it. It's not possible every single time, because at the end of the day, the PR industry is not really my industry and I may not have 100% understanding of it. But if there are simple tips that can help somebody get a foothold, I have tried to do that. And I know many journalist friends who have also tried to do that. But not always is it possible, and it's possible we may have slipped up at a time when it was very crucial for that PR person. But again, the onus can't completely be on the journalism side of it. There has to be on the individual and the training that they undergo in their field as well.
Absolutely.
The fourth point I have is to know the journalist you're approaching and to track their work. Now, this is again, I think, a continuation of our discussion on, that slip between the cup and the lip kind of thing. Considering there are so many different kinds of journalists today. You have the generalists, you have the independent ones, you have those who are on roles, you have the specialists. It's important to know what kind of journalist you're approaching and the kind of work they are doing. Because, like, for example, if someone approaches me with a technical thing, like say the launch of new machinery, there's honestly nothing I can do about it because it's not a field that I write in. And that's a complete waste of time for the PR approaching me and for me as well to have listened to the entire stream that comes with it. So knowing the journalist, what each kind of journalist is capable of is also important. Of late I've felt that differentiating primarily between who's an influencer, who's an independent journalist, and who's an on-road journalist is one of the three main differences that someone needs to learn. So yeah, that's my fourth point.
Absolutely. And I always tell I still do it myself, and I also advise all the PR professionals who join the industry, just Google it. There are websites that will tell you more about the journalists. In fact, the publications that they file with will also tell you the kind of stories that they have filed in the past. And you have different portals who dedicate themselves to this. If nothing else works, there is social media. A quick glance at their own LinkedIn pages or Twitter handle, tell you what they're following in. I mean, gone are the days where you were given a media list and said, just call this number and follow up. I remember the first call I ever did for a automotive press release that was sent out. It was mass disseminated some 20 years ago, and I was given a list and said, please call this number and ensure that they have received the press release. It didn't make sense to me, but it was told to me, and it was my first day on the job. And the first person I dialed, Ruth, had been deceased for 5 years.
Oh my goodness.
Imagine the earful that I got on day one.
Yeah.
It would have been enough for anybody to say, I'm not doing this, quit the field.
Right.
But those times are gone. I mean, I took the effort to go down there to each publication to understand who's filing this particular beat. You don't need to do that anymore. One Google search, one LinkedIn search will tell you everything about that journalist. If people refuse to do that, again, see the individual owners that I was speaking about.
Absolutely, that individual proactiveness. Because I can tell you, Tarunjit, even now at this moment, if you look at my WhatsApp, I have at least 3 messages from people whom I don't know saying, hey, I represent this particular client. Would you be interested in writing? And as a addition to that, if not, can you tell me whom I can approach with?
It's not your job to do that.
Exactly. So when I have the patience, I do respond and say this as politely as I can. But most of the time, honestly, I can't really afford to keep doing this over and over again. So yeah,
Absolutely.
that's
So PR professionals, if you're listening to this, please do your research.
Absolutely. So the 5th point that I have is to make a pitch like a journalist would. Now, I take this as an additional, I know this is an additional point of work for a PR person. But when you're making a pitch to a journalist, I think you need to think like a journalist would, and how that same journalist would pitch the story to their editor to get an approval. I think you need to learn how to do that as well. Every publication has its approach to a particular story, whether it is finance, business, culture. There is a particular language that goes with it. So if you're approaching a journalist from that publication or someone who writes for that publication, I feel a pitch that a journalist would normally do themselves, something to that similar effect would help both your client and the chances of being able to land that pitch and get the story through. I think that is also very important.
Absolutely.
My 6th one is etiquette. Now, this is something it's like a pet peeve. I am really bombarded with a lot of emails and WhatsApp messages that honestly BCC when it comes to email, and that's very, very impersonal. And I think it shows a certain lack of respect to the person that you're sending it out to, especially when you want some work done from them. And the messages that come with hi dear, I think that's also quite unprofessional. Messaging odd hours of the day. I have received messages at 10:30, 11, 12 in the night saying that I represent such a client. Can you do something for me? And then being harassed with a series of messages saying you haven't responded to me. So I think etiquette is very important, and it also includes getting the journalist's name right, and also including getting your client's name right. I actually had a PR person write to me and spell their client's name wrong. And when I wrote a message back and said, I think you mean this client and not that brand. And the message I get was, oh, I'm so sorry, I got my own client's name wrong. So I think there's a lot of etiquette that needs to go into it, and a little attention to detail that's important as well.
I don't encourage when brands ask you, who do you know in the media community, to judge whether they should hire you or work with you. I've always told them, give me a good story and we will find the right journalist for it.
Absolutely.
Give me good data, give me good statistics, make it a winnable story, something that they can't miss. And we will find the right journalist, we will find the right publication, we'll find the right column and make sure that it happens. But you have to give me these things to make sure that the story sees the light of the day. But if you're relying on my media relations, how well do I know a journalist to be able to get your story out? That's the complete wrong approach. That's an approach that I've been trying to get people to understand that. And in fact, it's that entire myth created by the entire PR industry that media relations is what we do. I think that means that orientation needs to change some way, and the change needs to happen from the PR industry itself. If you don't get your clients, you don't get your people to work on the story idea, how will that work?
Absolutely. I agree with you 100%. My next point, and the 7th point, that a PR person has the right to say no. I'm not going to comment from the client's perspective, but I know a lot of times that journalists, because they're at the crunch period and they need a quote that comes in, or they have a story where they think that your client might be a right fit. If you as a PR person feel that this does not work for my client or it doesn't make sense or they may not have the ability to respond the way the journalist like, I feel they should say no at that point because there have been many instances where PR person has committed and said, yes, we can do this. But when you get the copy, and this has happened to me personally, it's a plagiarized copy that's been outright copied from online, or it is very obvious that it was the wrong choice. I think journalists also sometimes make the wrong choices when it comes to thinking this person may work or this person may not work for their story. And I think PR people need to be able to just be okay with putting their foot down and saying, I don't think this works for my client. Maybe not this time, but happy to do it another time.
That's very sane advice. And Ruth, I'm so glad you mentioned this. We were talking about having an argument or having a discussion, having a debate. And
right.
Perfectly fine to do this. I wish more people did this because the journalist will in fact appreciate you or respect you more because you told them that this was not the right fit. Instead of chasing numbers for your client, look at building a reputation that will actually help them be who they are.
Absolutely. Yeah. My 8th point is now, I think this is something that's happened because of the influencer industry as such. And I think there needs to be a very clear distinction between what a journalist brings to the table versus what an influencer brings to the table. Many a times I have been asked by PR people for a story in a publication and simultaneously you run a campaign on your personal social media as well. So I've always tried to understand where exactly this comes from because I'm not a social media influencer and that's not what I bring to the table. I'm a journalist. So that I feel there is this distinction that needs to be made and I see this increasingly often. Okay, if you cannot give me a story, then will you at least put it on your social media if I give you the press release? And I'm like, that doesn't really make sense. I'm not sure what you're hoping to achieve with this. So I feel this distinction between journalist and influencer needs to be made very clear.
Absolutely. And I think the lines are getting blurred. So this confusion might be because there are a lot of independent journalists who also branched out as influencers. And a lot of PR professionals are going by that trend. A lot of PR professionals are painting everybody with the same brush. But it falls back to the earlier points that you've made, right? Research.
Absolutely. Research is key. Understanding who does what and what they bring to the table is absolutely essential.
But that's an interesting trend that's happening though.
It's very interesting. And it's interesting to see how media is evolving in that way. Like everyone has a voice, but it's interesting to see how it works. My 9th point, this comes from personal experience. If a PR person is unsure of what kind of story the client might put in, it's ideal to discuss this with the clients and with your own teammates rather than ask the journalist, do you think you can fit my client in anything that you're working on? That honestly sounds like a very desperate attempt, which is not how you want to project the client or your knowledge about the client. So if you're unsure of what kind of stories would work, I would say best speak with your colleagues, speak with the client, but don't expect the journalist to come up with story ideas for you.
Absolutely. And if I may chime in with a little bit of advice here for all the PR professionals who are listening to this podcast, don't chase the numbers. Encourage your client to look at it while you can have a minimum number that you work with, perfectly fine. Encourage your client to understand you need to build a reputation for them. Look for opportunities that are relevant for them rather than just desperately trying to look at getting them featured just about anywhere.
Absolutely agree. It is the quality of that exposure rather than the quantity or the number of times the client's name is mentioned. I think that's very important to brand image at the end of the day.
True.
And my 10th point, work on being a reliable resource. Now, PRs and journalists work together very closely in a number of fields, but I would like that relationship to move forward in many ways. It's not necessary that the PR person represents only their set of clients to the journalist. Many a times I know I have turned to PR people who are in a particular field and I've asked them for a contact which may not be their client, but whom I know they know and they can connect me with. Being able to do that and build a kind of, let me say, goodwill really goes a long way. Because it not only broadens the PR's perspective of that particular industry, but it also builds a sense of reliability for any other future stories that the journalist may be working on. When you know that you can rely on somebody, you are bound to turn to them time and again.
Absolutely. I think it's a dream of every PR professional to become the go-to person, to be the resource that.
Absolutely. Spot on. Go-to person is what I should have said. Yeah.
And in fact, very, very valid points, Ruth. I mean, these 10 commandments, I think, should be printed and put out there. But the media industry is changing so much, and that gives the PR industry so much of potential to expand, to grow, to pivot any way that they want. Is there one overarching advice that you would like to give PR professionals in the way they craft their career from now onwards?
I would say be proactive, observe the industry and the way it's evolving and adapt to the changes. It's very important not to stick by the tried and tested formula. Sometimes the most experimental thing can work. So be proactive and be ready to adapt. That would be my advice.
Absolutely. And how about one piece of advice for PR professionals so that they can retain sanity in the field?
Wow, okay. So this is something I practice myself. Everyone has a bad day and some days can be even worse than the other. I would say give yourself time to feel bad about it. Don't try to bottle it away. Spend the time to feel bad about it. It can be one entire evening. If you need to bawl your eyes out, please do that. But say at the end of this time frame, I'm going to be done feeling bad about this. I'm going to move on. It's a new day. But do give yourself the time to feel bad about something. We are all human. We all feel bad. And most of the time it's very valid. Those feelings are very, very valid. So don't hesitate to feel bad about something. Just time yourself on it and move on after that. Put it behind you.
That's very good life advice, I think. In any profession, in life, if people follow this, that will be wonderful rather than stewing on it and chewing it throughout their life.
Absolutely. Learn your lessons from it and just move forward.
We spoke a lot about how journalism has changed as well. What would your advice be to the graduating class of journalism this year?
You have strange new world that you're going out into. And I think the new crop of journalists have a lot of tools at their disposal that we did not have, say, 20 years ago. I would say, again, be proactive. Don't be lazy with your research. Take that extra effort to find out more, to ask the next question. Don't be happy with just one answer. Ask 10 questions more. You will always find something that you hadn't seen before. So that would be my advice.
And if the journalism students want to get into independent journalism, what is that one guiding rule that you will ask them to live by?
Graduating students of journalism, I'd say a standard of ethics is very important. Work ethics, that is. Stay true to that. That would be my key advice. And the second is to adapt to the changing industry without letting go of those ethics. There's a lot to learn. Keep learning. Don't think that you have reached the pinnacle of your career at just one. And if you're turning to independent journalism, I would say first be in the field as a full-timer, understand the pressures that go with it, all the aspects that go with it. Only then will you be prepared to handle all of those different aspects by yourself. As an independent, you become your own marketing manager, your advertising manager, your negotiator, your finance control, muscle man to get the money when it doesn't come from clients. There's a lot you need to do on your own, and only when you understand the pressures as a full-timer will you know what you're up for. So, yeah.
Absolutely, and I'm assuming, every publication would have different deadlines, different processes. So it's as good as 10 clients if you're contributing to 10 different people.
Yes, and you have to know their paperwork is intense. When you're talking finances, the paperwork for each kind of publication alone can take you a couple of days to get. So it's a lot of work that you take on besides just pitching stories, researching stories and working on them. There's a lot more that goes to it. So all the glamour is there, but all the glamour is in front of a lot of hard work and a lot of back-end work that takes place.
Absolutely, and that's everybody understands that upfront, not going by popular media and the representation of the independent journalists. They need to understand what actually goes into making that one byline out there.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So my last question for the day. If you were not in journalism, what would you be doing today? Would we see, and in the near future, will we see a movie coming out that has been directed or written by you?
I don't know about a movie, but honestly, if I hadn't gotten into journalism, I would have loved to be an air hostess with an international airline. I think that's what I would have been doing. It never really crossed my mind back then, but now I know that's what I would have loved to do.
Wow, okay. Is this coming from your love for travel or seeing new places,
Yes,
new people?
yes. It comes from my love for travel and the fact that I can be a pretty good hostess and I can handle the pressures of a career like that. I think that's definitely what I would have loved to do.
I would have never guessed that. Going by your stories and your fab Instagram page, I would have assumed that you would be doing something in food.
Yeah, when you're traveling, you get to eat a lot, right? So my Instagram handle would have travel and food even.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today, Ruth. I thoroughly enjoyed speaking to you today.
Thank you so much, Saranjeet, for having me. It's always a pleasure speaking to you.
So that was Ruth Dsouza speaking to us about her 10 commandments for a seamless work relationship between the PR and media community. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the podcast. We will be back with another interesting conversation from the world of PR and communication in our next episode. Stay tuned.